Okay, we're going to start notes over the causes of World War I. It starts chapter 29, section 1. In this section, we're really going to be talking about some of the things that contributed to World War I and some of the different factors that led to the outbreak of World War I. Before we get started, I just want to clear one thing up. So just so you know, I'm going to be saying things like the great powers in Europe. When I say that, the main great powers in Europe during this time was Germany, Austria-Hungary, Great Britain, Russia, Italy, and France. So just keep that in mind, that those were the main superpowers that were in Europe during the time right before and during the World War I. Okay, starting out, three of the main causes, well actually we're going to talk about four main causes, but these three ideas were part of the reason why Europe's nations had lots of tension and lots of rivalry between them in the time period leading up to World War I. The first was nationalism. Nationalism is just increased loyalty to one person's nation. We talked about nationalism a little bit when we talk about India. British imperialism in India and how India started to really identify with themselves and wanted independence. Well, that's what nationalism is. It was just increased loyalty to their nations, and this nationalism that was going on through Europe really started to cause rivalry between other nations. Because nations were starting to identify more with themselves, they were starting to take more pride in their nation, there started to become more of a rivalry between nations. Also, there was disputes over materials and territories. During this time, we talked about it, the Industrial Revolution was going on in Europe, or in England more specifically, and Germany and other nations really wanted to cash in on that. They wanted to build industry in their own nation. So there was disputes over raw materials and kind of like competition to get raw materials, as well as competition to get territory for those raw materials. Also, during this time, there was lots of nationalism in the Balkan Peninsula, and we'll talk more later in this unit about the Balkan Peninsula and how it's kind of like a powder keg, and it was a really volatile area. But Balkan Peninsula had these nations that were once owned by the Ottoman Empire really started to have lots of nationalism. They started to want to rise up and become independent and to rule their own nations. So that kind of caused lots of tension in the main powers in Europe, because some countries were in support of their independence and some were not. Another thing that led to the outbreak of World War I was imperialism. We talked about imperialism last time, and we know that imperialism is just going into a nation and taking over all of their economy, their social and political aspects, and basically creating a colony. Well, once you're doing that, you're going to have competition. And as we saw with Africa, there was lots of competition between these European nations to get land. Again, for materials, for raw materials. We talked about that imperialism, one of the main reasons why they were going into those nations was to get raw materials, to build markets for their economy. So this race to get these materials caused other nations to start to compete with each other. Each nation wanted to have more colonies than the next. So it started to create a tension and a rivalry between the nations in Europe, those main powers in Europe. Another thing that intensified and created a tension before the World War I was militarism. And militarism is basically the idea that the military power is very glorified, and the nation always has a standing army ready and prepared for war. And this was just kind of stemming off of nationalism as well as imperialism, because nationalism, they started to get pride in their nation. They wanted to build up the army to make it great, and they also needed more army the more colonies that a nation would get. So they needed more army to support that colony and to be able to protect their colonies. So militarism, was just the idea that in order for that country to be great, you had to have a great standing army that was always prepared for war with the latest technology. And this kind of led to an arms race. That nations started to try to compete with each other to have the best army. So this also led to tension and rivalry in Europe. Another main cause of World War I was alliances. And we're going to talk about some of those alliances that got kind of tangled and twisted up in Europe during this time that led to the outbreak of World War I. Excuse me. We know what an alliance is. An alliance is just forces coming together and into an agreement that they would not go to war, that they would protect each other. So during this time, the Chancellor of Germany, he was the Chancellor of Prussia, which was a state in Germany, or a kingdom in Germany. His name was Otto von Bismarck. And he used war and force to unify Germany in 1871. And in 1871, he says Germany is a satisfied power. It's now a unified power. All of their states have brought together under one empire. So then he turns his focus to unifying Europe. So Bismarck, he sees France as a threat because of the Franco-Prussian Wars. He fears that France is still bitter about their their territorial losses. So he sees France as a threat to peace in Europe. So what he does is he forms an alliance between Germany and Austria-Hungary to basically isolate France. And this is the dual alliance. And eventually, Italy joins 3 years later and becomes the Triple Alliance. He does this to kind of isolate France and gain friends around Germany so that they can be strong and united. To do that, also, he signs treaties with Russia, which this was kind of a risky idea because Russia and Austria-Hungary were not always at peace on things. They had some areas in the Balkans. Austria-Hungary wanted to control areas in the Balkans as well as Russia. So they had some tension there, and he knew that this was not a good idea. But he went ahead and made this alliance anyway. Well, this alliance kind of gets out of hand. In 1890, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany comes to power, and he forces Bismarck to resign. He was a very proud man, and Kaiser Wilhelm II did not want to share his power with anyone. So he forces Otto von Bismarck to resign, and he allows that treaty with Russia to lapse or to expire, to run out. And in response to this, Russia turns around and builds an alliance with France in 1892 and in 1894. So now this makes Germany an enemy of both France and Russia. So now Germany's starting to realize if there was ever a war, if there was an outbreak of a war in Europe, that Germany would have to fight on its eastern borders in France as well as its the eastern borders of Russia, because Germany borders Russia in the east, and the western border of France because Germany borders France in the west. So Wilhelm starts to build up Germany's navy. And he wants to do that to rival the British Navy. As you all know, we've talked about it in 8th grade. We've talked about it this year. The British Navy was the strongest and most impressive navy in Europe during this time. This makes the British kind of nervous. This was kind of a tactic to make the British start to get nervous, and the British start to strengthen up their fleet. They start to get a larger fleet. They start to battle that the shipbuilding program that was going on in Germany. Well, they also form an entente or an alliance with France in 1904. So at this time, you have the British, the French, and the Russians are now the Triple Entente, and that's what they become in 1907. So now after this, you have two separate camps. You have the Triple Alliance, which is made up of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. And then you have the Triple Entente, which is made up of Russia, France, and Great Britain. Imperialism, nationalism, militarism, and alliances that led to the breakout of World War I in Europe. But let's talk about another region in Europe that also kind of sparked lit the spark that blew up and made the war happen. It was kind of a volatile area during the time. It was filled with ethnic conflict, ethnic nationalism, lots of tension. There were disputes about Austria wanting to occupy parts of the Balkans, disputes about Russia wanting to occupy parts of the Balkans. So it was a very volatile area. They became known as Europe's powder keg because any spark that went off in the Balkans could explode into a huge conflict, causing a huge war. And that's eventually what happens. The Balkans at this time were occupied a lot by the Ottoman Empire, but that actually starts to decline during the beginnings of World War I, or the beginnings of the 1900s. So by the 1900s, the Ottomans' control in the Balkans and the Ottoman Empire itself really starts to decline. And many of the Balkan nations are starting to struggle to free themselves from Ottoman rule. One Balkan nation in particular, Armenia, they tried to demand their freedom from the Turks, and it resulted in the Armenian massacre. Basically, the Armenians tried to demand their independence from the Ottomans. They were Christian Armenians. And as you guys know, the Ottoman Empire is made up of mainly Muslim. But the Christian Armenians, they tried to demand their freedom from the Ottoman Turks. And what it did is it resulted in lots of tension between the Turkish rulers and the Armenians. The Turkish troops killed tens and thousands of Armenians, and especially whenever the Armenians refused to support them in World War I, they were being deported and killed for not supporting the Turks. And this became known as the Armenian Massacre. It was a very tragic time of a very politically fueled murders. But some of these nations were able to free themselves from the Ottomans, and nations came out such as Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, Montenegro, and Romania. Those were a few examples of some of the nations that were able to come out and free themselves from the Ottoman Empire. After they were able to do that, they had a very strong sense of nationalism. And because of that, they all wanted to extend their borders. And in particular, the nation of Serbia wanted to absorb all of the Slavs in the Balkan Peninsula. And the Slavs are just a ethnic group that was very populous in the Balkan region. Russia and Austria-Hungary were in a conflict over this Serbian nationalism because Russia has a really high Slavic population. The Russians supported Serbia, but the people in Austria-Hungary were very threatened by their growth and their nationalism, and they really feared a rebellion by the Slavic population in Austria-Hungary. So they did not support this Serbian nationalism. They did not support Serbia as a nation. In 1908, Austria goes in and takes over an area called Bosnia-Herzegovina. And Bosnia was just an area, it was a Balkan nation that had or a Balkan area that had a very large Slavic population. The Serbian people were outraged, and Russia supported Serbia. They were willing to back Serbia up in a war. However, they were very unprepared. Russia was not as industrialized. They didn't have the supplies that they needed. So when Germany said that they were going to back up Austria-Hungary, the Serbs had to back down because they knew that Russia would not be able to support them. But by 1914, Serbia had been able to fight in several local conflicts. They were able to get lots of extra territory, and they started to really have more confidence. So they tried to regain Bosnia-Herzegovina from Austria because they wanted to occupy that land. Austria-Hungary basically vowed that they were going to crush any attempt to drive them out of the Balkans. So that created a lot of tension over territory in the Balkans because Serbia wanted to gain a lot of the Slavic population, a lot of the Slavic areas, but so did Austria-Hungary and parts of Russia. The immediate cause of war, the actual spark that lights the powder keg, was a very famous event. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, his name was Franz Ferdinand, he goes to Sarajevo, which was the capital of Bosnia. So this Austria-Hungarian political official, he was the heir to the throne, goes to Sarajevo in Bosnia, and he and his wife are basically shot point blank. So he's assassinated when he's driving through the streets. And the killer, they find out, his name is Gavrilo Princip, and he was a Serbian member of a group called the Black Hand. And the Black Hand was just it was a political organization that was anti-Austrian. It was to get Austria out of Bosnia. It was a political organization. Well, Austria decides that they're going to punish Serbia, and they're going to do it with the support of Germany. And Germany is really outraged by this. They wanted Austria, they said, be really aggressive. You should make Serbia and pay for this. So Austria tells Serbia, okay, we're going to give you an ultimatum. You have to end all the anti-Austrian activity. You have to allow all the Austrian leaders into Serbia to investigate the assassination. And there were several other conditions to this ultimatum. Because they knew if they did not accept these offers that it would probably lead to a war, Serbia says okay to most of the demands, but they offer to have other issues settled at an international conference. Austria, however, they really didn't want to do that. They didn't have any desire to get together and negotiate at a conference. So Austria rejects this offer and they declare war on Serbia. They declare war on Serbia, so Russia backs up and they take action, and Russian troops move toward the Austrian border. Okay, so at this time, the leaders all over those great powers of Europe are really starting to wake up. There has now been an active war. Okay, so these were the main causes of World War I, and the shooting of Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo was kind of the spark that lit the powder keg that exploded into World War I. Next time